Hello, I'm Amy Heath again, and today I thought it might be fun to do a little songwriting workshop for our creativity session. To start, I have a website. You can use your phone and scan that. It was also in the front if you got a chance. Once you do that, I'll give a moment for that. You will see a website that looks like this. If you did not get it, I apologize. But it is very handy. If you look at it, it gives you you can select a key, and it will give you all the chords in that key. And if you press play, you can drag it down into the bottom to make a chord progression. And if you press play, you will hear that chord progression. So it's a little, if you're not musically inclined and you don't have an instrument, this is a fun little website you can use to create your own songs. But I am actually going to use a different website because I play guitar, and that is the next one here. It's also in the order of service, both links. And the links are also in the chat for those of you online. So what we are going to do is we are going to write a little bit of a lyric together. And the first thing we need to do, this is going to take a little bit of interaction. I know we had the dinner last night, so I hope that we can get that, that interaction. But first thing we need is a key. So does anyone have a key, any letter A through G? C. I heard C. That's great because that's the one I'm on. Okay, so I'm just trying to get a little melody going. All right, that'll work. So now we need a topic, and we want a topic that's not too broad, like love, but perhaps nothing too narrow either, perhaps something like love between friends or something like that. So anyone have a topic? This is kind of like a songwriting improv, I guess. Any topic that you can think of? Grace. Oh, that one's a tough one. All right, so grace. So what is something we think about when we think of grace?
Being free from sin.
Forgiveness, being free. Okay, forgiveness, all right. Now we need, now with songwriting, we need a little bit of a rhyme. So, grace is given to me. Oh, grace, it helps us to become free. All right. So I like this. Anyone have another word that rhymes with free? C? C? Need my chords back. Oh, grace, it is given to me. Oh, grace, I'm finally free. And we talk of freedom from this land. Okay. So we just wrote a little mini song together. I thought it might be kind of fun if I worked on it a little bit on my own and maybe one of these services brought it back. So thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Amy. You're a tough act to follow. I just want to say that. In something of a contrast to Amy and Gordon, my perspective on creativity is that of a scientist and atheist. While perhaps not as widely recognized as in the arts, creativity does play a key role in the practice of science as well. Recent research in neurobiology also gives us some insight into how creativity and consciousness emerge from the evolutionary processes that have shaped our brains. Perhaps fortuitously for future scientists and artists of all kinds, however, a great deal of mystery still remains. Although there are several well-known examples of creative ideas that led to mathematical and scientific breakthroughs, I'd like to indulge in two examples of how creativity has affected my own career as a scientist, before turning briefly to what little we know about the origins of creativity in the brain. For my first example, as I was finishing my graduate thesis, I was trying to solve the problem of how 3 strands of DNA can match up during a type of DNA repair called homologous recombination. Using some accurate plastic models of DNA and crude computer images I made on the original version of the Macintosh computer, I stumbled across a novel way to specifically bond a 3rd strand into the canonical double-strand model discovered by Watson and Crick from compelling data generated by Rosalind Franklin. On the first slide, you can see that, thank you. You can see 2 of the triplet combinations that could be formed, and on the second slide, the other 2. I promise they're different. I know they look the same, but they're different. Most excitingly, this new model complemented the iconic elegant symmetry of the Franklin, Watson, and Crick double-stranded version. Thus, I felt I had a small flash of the creative feeling Watson and Crick must have had in the late 1950s, when the symmetry of their model fell into place with the metal and wire models that they had. Having constructed the model, I shared it with my 2 advisors, both experienced DNA biochemists, who thought something must be wrong. Since it seemed so obvious, they both felt that if it was correct, someone else must have already discovered it. Although they had never seen the model before, they could also find nothing wrong with it. To make a long story short, they were in fact right. As a colleague later presented a more comprehensive version of the model, an older scientist pointed out that the structure had in fact been previously created and published in 1967, when I was 4 years old. Unfortunately, it was in an obscure journal, and the knowledge was lost for over 20 years. More recently, my work has been to develop in vitro assays, which mimic the action of novel drugs in patients' bodies. This is an important part of the development of drugs, and particularly the relatively new branch of biologics, such as Enbrel, Evusheld, and Keytruda. In order to design the assays, one has to understand the biology of how the drug is supposed to work in the patient, as well as ways to engineer cells and molecules so that otherwise invisible functions can be easily and sensitively measured. One classic example, One classic example is to replace a gene of interest with the gene for firefly luciferase, such that when a cell is affected by the drug, the cell emits light, as fireflies do so beautifully during nights when they're mating. With that background in place, where does creativity fit in? When presented with a new drug candidate, our team needs to use our experience and tools to quickly design an assay to test the molecule. When the work is going well, the best designs seem to just pop into our heads, nearly fully formed, with no apparent conscious effort. This seems to be a clear example of a creative process that occurs somewhere in the subconscious part of the brain that is as inaccessible to conscious search as the notes of a beautiful song, the indelible phrase of a poem, or the brushstrokes of an expressionist painting. On the best days, these flashes of insight also have a certain elegance, albeit one that can only probably be appreciated by colleagues with a similar background. Still, these moments, if one stops to appreciate them, lend a great satisfaction to the work. So turning to my last element, I'm very interested in the neurological basis of creativity. It's well known that humans generally segregate different activities in the right and left hemispheres of our brains. For example, most language ability is located in the left hemisphere, as shown by the difficulty of people with left hemisphere lesions to communicate. To some extent, the constant narrative of our interior lives terminates in the language center in the left of our brains. But while this left brain function can accurately select words to convey a message, the creative aspect of writing seems instead to come from the right hemisphere, as apparently do other creative processes such as musical and visual arts. An interesting first-hand exploration of this is found in Jill Bolte Taylor's My Stroke of Insight, where she describes the creative, blissful state she experienced after a massive left hemisphere stroke, until brain plasticity enabled her to restore language and other executive functions over time. To a lesser extent, I think we've all experienced that feeling of on the tip of my tongue when trying to find the perfect word or phrase that will turn a piece of writing from merely informational to transformative. At this point, I haven't seen any hypothesis as to why we've evolved this mysterious veil over the right hemisphere process, unlike the left, which seems to be more accessible. Is it a bug or a feature? I sometimes imagine contact with an alien intelligence or perhaps some future AI who lack our hemispheric segregation. Perhaps as we learn to translate their language process, we might be able to retrain our brains to lift the veil and directly contact our creative core. But on second thought, maybe that's a bad idea. It might ruin the human experience of being creative. For now, we can embrace with awe the invisible process of exploring the infinite space of creativity that speaks to one of the most defining characteristics of being human.
The famed author Shel Silverstein wrote in his poem titled Masks, "She had blue skin, and so did he. She kept it hid, and so did he. They searched for blue their whole life through, and passed right by, and never knew." When I was asked if I would speak on creativity for this service, I thought that it would be essential to discuss the ways in which we create ourselves, the ways in which we look inward and to find ourselves and gain the strength to project that person out into the world. For me, and for many other queer people, that creative technique is rooted in my culture and my culture's oldest art form, the art of drag. Not too long ago, we had a guest minister speak at this congregation, and he had discussed queerness in a theoretical sense, as being so at odds with the rest of the world around you that you must create a space for yourself. As a drag artist myself, and a sister of perpetual indulgence, aka a queer drag nun, and being a queer non-binary person that I am, I thought that it was of the utmost importance and in compliance with my vows as a sister to point out how truly horrific it is that the repugnant Klan party is trying to ban drag, and to emphasize the significance of drag to the queer community in being that creative force historically, presently, and its essential role in securing the future of our community and our civil rights. Especially when I have the opportunity to speak in front of a congregation of people whose stated denominational purposes are to uphold and promote social justice, and I quote, "Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression." It is interesting to me that April was chosen as the month to be themed around creativity, instead of during Pride Month in June. We queer folks are a community of creatives, incessantly mischaracterized and often disenfranchised. We are a community that is constantly creating ourselves in a space where we are told not to exist. This is the real inspiration for the art of drag. It is so much more than it often appears. It is more than just entertainment and illusion. In recent years, the mainstream has begun to see drag in a very specific light, and that depiction of drag is often less than accurate. So for those in the room with little exposure to drag, or for those that think RuPaul's Drag Race is the authoritative representation of drag, please allow me to educate you for 2 minutes. Drag is so much more than cisgender men dressing as women. The definition of what drag is much broader and harder to define. It includes people of all genders, gender expressions, sexes, and sexual orientations, and it always has. Drag is the experimentation of gender. Drag is the challenge to the arbitrary gender norms that often do not apply to queer people. As a drag queen, king, person, thing, monster, impersonator, character, etc., you can be anything you want to be, regardless of what you're told you can be. You can be legendary. That's divine. Legendary drag queen divine. You can be another person, even a celebrity. No, that's not Cher. That's Chad Michaels. You can be campy. Oh, I'm sorry, you can be glamorous. That's Violet Chachki. You can be campy. We all recognize this one, come on, Queen. If you don't know what campy is, allies, don't worry, we'll explain that to you later. You can be scary, the Boulet brothers. You can be ugly, like Dahlia Black. You can be confusing, like Hunger. You can be feminine, like Amanda Lepore. You can be masculine, like Landon Sider. You can be neither, or you can even be a member of the clergy, like the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. You can be anything you can imagine. Drag is an open defiance of the erasure of queer existence. It is the oldest and most visible form of protest in the interests of the queer community. Drag as an art form paved the way through fabulousness and costumes. At times when our language was much more limited and not fully able to describe the reality of human experience, drag paved the way for those of us who are different. Most notably, the transgender community which exists within our community. Now, being trans and being a drag are not the same thing at all, and I do want to make that very clear. However, there was a time when the public conflated those two things as being the same thing. Sorry, I lost my place here. Now, and it was the perseverance of drag queens as leaders in our community, many of whom were transgender themselves, and their refusal to accept gender norms that paved the way for many of us, including myself, who are members of the transgender community, to be able to exist openly, however limited that still is in our time when transgender people are still being murdered at an alarming rate. American heteronormativity, a cultural construct that is rooted in white supremacy and pervasive all around us, tells us that we must conform to being one thing or another, one role or another. And we're told that these roles are preset for us from birth, predetermined by an unknown force and identified solely by our anatomy, and not by the truth of what we know instinctively in our hearts and in our minds. So for everyone here, queer or otherwise, I encourage you to be unlike the people in Shel Silverstein's poem. I encourage you to take your mask off and be your true self, despite any shame you may have been taught to feel. Even if that means dressing up in ostentatious or flamboyant ways. I encourage you to keep doing this and doing your art, whatever your art may be. And I encourage you to encourage others to do the same, and create spaces for them to do the same. I encourage you to vote, vote, vote at election time, and call your representatives, and support those in our country, especially those in other states who are currently being oppressed. I encourage you to continue the work of Unitarian Universalists and fight for justice with your creativity and maintain eternally the search for truth and meaning. Thank you.